we were talking last time about the summit meetings. Two summit meetings. One was a summit meeting which did take place between the two Western allies. That was Roosevelt and Churchill, Casablanca, 1943, at the end of the transitional period, the turning of the tide, when the landing in Northern Africa had already taken place. And this summit meeting had different consequences. The unconditional surrender approach and the bombing of the industrial and civilian targets of Germany in order to hasten the end of the war. Then we saw a second summit meeting, but this time a summit meeting where the three main leaders did participate. And that was the Tehran summit meeting, late November, early December 1943. I told you that this was, of the three top summit meetings, where all three would be present, the most important for the evolution of the war and for the evolution of the post-war period. It was not, unlike which is what is very often believed, it was not Yalta. Yalta got the name in history, it became a legend, but it was Tehran where the decisions were taken. And it was not Potsdam, because Potsdam was at the end of the war, and so the decisions at Potsdam practically only specified what had been decided at Yalta, and Yalta took the conclusions of what had been said at Tehran. Before we looked on the summit meeting of Tehran, I told you that all three summit meetings did take place in Soviet-controlled territory, and that this already was a clear indication that Stalin would have a decisive influence. And then we have seen what kind of attitudes the summit participants had. The American president, Churchill, Stalin, and then we focused on the two major issues. One was where would the second landing take place, which was requested by Stalin from the beginning on, and then what would be the future of Germany. This second question will be brought up again onto the table of conference and will be decided differently later on. The important issue, where would the second front be opened? And so we have seen that last time. And with the consequences we know, and I told you that the loser here, if we can speak about the loser, was Churchill. He ultimately was disavowed by Roosevelt, who joined Stalin's approach that the second landing should take place in Normandy. But the war evolved from late 1943 on, 44. The situation evolved in such a way that D-Day came, the landing in Normandy June 6, the liberation of Paris, the Warsaw Uprising, with the consequences it entailed, and then ultimately in October 1944, a new summit meeting where only two of the war participants did take part. That is Churchill and Stalin. And this summit meeting again did take place not only in Russian-controlled territory, but in Moscow, because Churchill flew to Moscow. Important is that Roosevelt did not participate. Roosevelt even strongly disapproved of Churchill's initiative. He started developing suspicions of what Churchill really meant. It was a little bit as if he did not understand what was going on. Now, Churchill, when he flew to Moscow, that was already the proof that he came as a petitioner. It was not a summit meeting between two equal partners. He wanted particularly something from Stalin was in a position of strength, because the Red Army in October 1944 had already was on the verge to move to the German frontier, that is to prepare for the attack of Germany. had already entered Romania and Bulgaria and was moving in the direction of Hungary and Austria. So in other words, Stalin was practically on the whole front, on the offensive, and was occupying those areas which practically had been abandoned to him after the decision of Tehran, after the decision that the second landing would take place, and ultimately did take place in Normandy. So in other words, Churchill went to see Stalin in order to save what could be saved. That is, from his original plan. Remember, his original idea had been to land in the Balkan area, to land in Greece and move up. There was no landing in Greece at that time, at least. So in other words, what could Churchill do to keep the Russians, in as much as this was a viable perspective, to keep the Russians as far away as possible from vital interest of the British? So in other words, they met in Moscow. Stalin knew exactly what Churchill was going after, and Churchill knew what Stalin had in mind. So what did they do then? They divided up. What was at stake was the future of the Balkan area. That is, the future of the southeastern tip of Europe, because Central Europe and Eastern Europe would be in Russian hands anyway. The problem was, how far could the Russians be kept away from coming too close to the Mediterranean? And so in order to veil, to hide what was really at stake, they started then dividing up the countries which are located in the Balkan area in spheres of interest. Spheres of interest of the Soviet Union or of England. So it was decided, and that was of course something which Stalin would absolutely request, that Romania and Bulgaria would be Russian zones of influence. Now, how would they divide these up? They would say 90% of influence would be for Russia, in Bulgaria and in Romania, and 10% for England. So in other words, it was really Russian sphere of influence. Hungary and Yugoslavia would be split up 50-50. 50% Russian influence, 50% British influence. Now, this was on paper a decision which in practical terms could barely be realized by Churchill, because first of all, Hungary lay towards the interior. The British had no direct access to Hungary, whereas the Red Army was coming from Romania, moving into the direction of the Red Army was present at the gates of Hungary at that time. About Yugoslavia, the situation was the following, that in Yugoslavia there was a guerrilla war well on its way, and the main guerrilla leader was a communist partisan leader. And this communist partisan leader was Tito, T-I-T-O. Tito was at the head of an underground communist guerrilla army, which was step by step liberating Yugoslavia, which was nonetheless, the British had a certain influence. Tito was getting weapons also from the British. So in other words, this 50-50 division of Hungary and Yugoslavia looked much more as a barely veiled excuse for letting the Russians have the decisive say in these countries. There remained only one country where Churchill claimed that 90% of influence should go to the British and 10% to the Russians, and that was Greece. Churchill argued that Greece should be in the British sphere of influence, 90% for the British and 10% for the Russians. So that is what came out of this Moscow meeting of Churchill in October 1944.
How did they decide on what to do about Austria?
Austria was supposed to be this will be decided in Yalta. Austria and Germany, because Austria was technically speaking, a part of Germany, because Hitler had annexed it. So the specific decisions for these two areas will be taken in Yalta.
You said the three summit meetings were the one with church with all three parties, then this one in Moscow, but what was the third one?
That will be Potsdam later on.
Okay, we haven't talked about it.
No, Potsdam will come after the war.
Okay.
And in Potsdam there was only one participant who had been in all the others, and that was Stalin. Roosevelt was dead, Truman was the American president, and Churchill was gone after a week because he lost the election, and Clement Attlee, the Labour leader, came and represented Great Britain. We'll see that afterwards. So in other words, Churchill was able to get this concession from Stalin. Because why did he insist upon it, that Greece should be a British zone of influence? Because the situation in Greece was similar to the situation in Yugoslavia. That is, in Greece, there was, on the one hand, in Greece itself, there was a guerrilla war going on. And the Greek guerrilla was communist. The communists controlled the Greek underground, the guerrilla war. Whereas the Greek government was in exile in Alexandria, in Egypt, where there were also a number of Greek troops which had been evacuated when the Germans occupied Greece in early 1941. So in other words, Churchill wanted to save Greece, because after all, Greece was, with its Mediterranean coast, was of vital importance for the British. The British had at that time important strongholds in the Mediterranean. The British, remember, they had Yalta, the Germans they had, Malta. The British had not lost Malta to the Germans. The British were on Cyprus, the British had Gibraltar, and the British were in Egypt. So in other words, the British had a strong interest of not letting the Russians spread their influence in the Mediterranean area. And so Churchill, by the way, followed up this agreement with Stalin. Roosevelt strongly condemned it. Roosevelt went even so far, when he heard about this, that he suspected of wrongdoing, not Stalin, but Churchill. Roosevelt suspected that Churchill was reawakening in the British imperial past, that he wanted to spread British influence in the Mediterranean. He did not understand that Churchill wanted to keep Stalin out of the area. So soon afterwards, the British landed some forces of their own and some forces of Greek exile army units from Egypt on the Greek mainland. In other words, the British brought back conservative Greek army forces, which barely had they landed on the Greek mainland and in the neighborhood of Athens, that they started clashing with the communist Greek guerrilla. In other words, the landing of the Greek exile forces with British support on the Greek mainland had as a consequence a civil war with the communist underground. The Russians, and that is remarkable, Stalin stood to his agreement. Stalin did not take advantage of the Greek communist guerrilla potential in order to expand his influence in Greece. And in that regard, we must say that he, in that sense, was more in line with, let's say, with Russian expansionist rather than with communist expansionist tendencies. Remember, he stood for both. But while they were in Moscow, the two men, meeting sometimes at the fireplace, as we say, exchanged confidences. And I told you that Stalin even went on 2 occasions. He spoke freely, but not, of course, in strategic terms, but about the past and about their way of handling things. For instance, he would admit to Churchill that the collectivization process, which he had carried out after 1928, 1929, had cost the lives of nearly 10 million people. That was the first time that Stalin admitted, in a moment of confidentiality to a Western leader, how much the Russian people paid for his collectivization, for his Stalin revolution. And it was also during this meeting that they exchanged, we do not know whether it was true, the saying went afterwards, that they spoke about their different ways of handling problems. I think I mentioned that already in class. How do you do it when a crime has been committed and you know that the guilty fellow is hiding among 100 other people? Did I tell you that in class?
Yeah, you said in the other class.
I'm sorry, I sometimes forget making the wrong confidences, unlike Stalin, on the wrong place. So they exchanged ideas, and so Stalin asked Churchill, how do you do it then in order to catch the criminal who is guilty of having committed? Well, Churchill said, well, we have a criminal police, we have Scotland Yard, and they will investigate and bring together all the elements and ultimately track down the guilty fellow. And then Stalin said, well, will you be sure that you caught the right man with this kind of investigation? Then Churchill said, well, how are you doing it then, to be sure? And Stalin had apparently a grin on his face. I said, I'll take them all.
Yeah.
I killed the 100, so I'm sure that I got the right fellow, amongst the others. That is, of course, probably si non è vero e ben trovato, as the Italians would say. If it is not true, it is nonetheless, it hits a point how Stalin proceeded, to be sure of something. He would not hesitate to sacrifice 99 others to be sure that he got the 100th one. Now, this being said, Churchill left and he came home. Meanwhile, in the United States, the elections did take place, and Roosevelt got a fourth mandate, with having as vice president Harry Truman, and not anymore Wallace. Because Wallace had been his running mate, the vice president, before, for the third mandate. And the least we can say, Wallace had shown a great degree of comprehension for the attitude of Stalin, whereas Truman, as the senator of Missouri, he had no experience whatsoever in foreign policy, but he had nonetheless the reputation of being an honest, correct man who would call things by their name. And by the way, he had made a reputation in the years preceding his nomination as a vice presidential candidate. He had been put in charge of a committee which was established by the American Congress in order to save money in terms of war expenditures. Because, you know, when there are huge government spending programs, very often there are government expenditures which are not necessary. And Truman was able, in his investigation committee, to make savings in those days of $15 billion, which were not necessary for the war effort. So in other words, he had the reputation of being a very honest man and straight to the point. But he had no experience in foreign policy. And Roosevelt would not introduce him to his foreign policy dealings, which he still had in mind. But Roosevelt's main advisor during these years, there were two men who had a great influence on Roosevelt. One was Harry Hopkins. Harry Hopkins was becoming a man of confidence and of a major advisor to Roosevelt, and even also in the transition period to Truman. And on the other hand, it was practically the most important man in the Pentagon, that is the head of the chiefs of staff, and that was General Marshall, who had a good comment, was not only a great military figure, but which was also had a great common sense. So General Marshall and Harry Hopkins were Roosevelt's advisors, but Truman was, as a vice president, he had no say, no insight. And nobody expected that the evolution of Roosevelt's health would become as dramatic as it ultimately did develop. So, yes.
Why did Roosevelt choose Truman to run with instead of Wallace's selection?
I think Truman, because this was essentially for internal political reasons. Truman was bringing the Middle West and the West, and had a good reputation among a certain conservative, democratic, let's say, constituency, whereas Wallace was already suspected by the Republicans of being too comprehensive towards Stalin. So it was domestic issues, electoral issues, which I think made him pick Truman. I must say that Truman is one of your presidents I most admire, because simply he found himself in a job for which he had not been prepared, and the way he handled it will be remarkable. It will be discovered. Now, meanwhile, the next summit meeting at 3 was prepared, because after all, we were now, with the American presidential elections being away, November, December, the war the Battle of the Bulge was raging, and the Red Army was moving towards the frontiers of Germany and preparing for the attack against Berlin, and at the same time moving through Hungary into the direction of Austria. So in other words, the war was coming to a close, and it was urgent that decisions would be made on what would be done next. What would be done next with Germany? What would be done next with Eastern Europe? How would the war evolve in the Far East? And what would be the prospect of a future, how should I say, of a future rearrangement of international relations? What would be done in order to prevent a repeat of what happened in 1939? So these were all issues, so it was considered necessary to organize a summit meeting. And this summit meeting is the best known in history, even though, and there were important decisions taken also. But as far as the future of the war was concerned, and the future of Eastern Europe, it was not Yalta, which will be important. It was Tehran. So they picked Yalta. Stalin invited his partners to come to Yalta. Yalta is a resort place on the Black Sea, on the Crimean. It is an area where in the past the Russian Tsars, well, let's say, they withdrew during the winter or during the summer, depending. This meant that Churchill and also Roosevelt, that they had to take upon themselves to have a difficult long journey. Whereas Stalin, I'm not sure at all whether Stalin ever took the airplane. He could go on train down to Yalta, there was no problem. For Roosevelt, it was a very painful trip. He had to fly out from Washington to Northern Africa, and then ultimately to the Crimean. And by that time, his health was already failing. He will die two months later, after all. Nobody, of course, suspected it, but still. So they came and accepted Stalin's hospitality, which meant from the beginning on that Stalin was in a strong position. He was in a strong position because his allies had come to the place, and also because the Red Army was victoriously advancing on every front, whereas at the moment when the preparations were made, and also at the beginning, the Western Allies were stuck with the Battle of the Bulge.
What was the date for y'all though?
February 4th till February the 11th, 1945. So, Roosevelt was coming with requests. And Stalin also, of course, had his visions. Roosevelt had two major requests on Stalin. First of all, he wanted Stalin's agreement that he would support his own vision of a post-war organization, internationally speaking, that is on his project for the United Nations organization, for the UN. Stalin agreed that the Russians said that they would be part of it. But, first of all, as far as the UN was concerned, there are two institutions which play a major role. As far as the UN is, well, there are more, but two key institutions. One is the Security Council. This is the Security Council which included, in those days, those countries which were considered as great powers, even though it was to some degree fiction. Who were those great powers who were members at the Security Council? Of course, the United States and the Soviet Union and England, the three major war participants, plus, on the insistence also of Churchill, plus France and China. China at that time was national China. So they were the five members, the five permanent members of the Security Council. On Stalin's insistence and also on the United States' insistence, the Security Council had a veto power. Each member had a veto power. So in other words, if a decision was taken on the level of the Security Council or on the level of the General Assembly, that is the second institution, which would go against the interest of one of the five permanent members, this member could veto the decision, which meant he would practically neutralize. Nothing could be done in terms of decision making against the will of one member of the Security Council. Here, the United States and Stalin agreed. Then came the issue of the General Assembly. As far as the General Assembly was concerned, Stalin argued during the discussion that the Soviet Union was not one country, but that these were, let's take the final number, 15 republics. And so he claimed that he wanted to get 15 votes on the level of the General Assembly. And then Roosevelt argued that the United States were not one country, but 48 states. It was Hawaii and Alaska had not yet achieved the status. And so ultimately a compromise was made. But you know what the compromise was? The United States got one vote and that Russia got 3 votes. Because the fiction was upheld that there would be a Soviet Socialist Republic, a Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic, and a Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. It was a fiction. But the Soviet Union got 3 votes at the General Assembly, and the United States got 1 vote. The same as Luxembourg. Can you imagine that? The contrast could not be more vivid than this. So in other words, Stalin he agreed, but he got ultimately what he wanted. Then came the second request on Roosevelt's part. And the second request was that Stalin should enter the war against Japan. Because the war against Japan was costing, at that point we are in February, the lives of thousands of American soldiers. And particularly the battles of Okinawa and Iwo Jima had cost the life of so many, so that the American generals calculated that if nothing substantial would be done, that the war in the Far East might last until 1946, and one could calculate that up to 1 million American lives would be lost in this war. Let alone what this would mean in terms of casualties for the Japanese army or for the Japanese civilians. So Stalin said yes, that he would enter the war, but only 3 months after the end of the war in Europe. And as the war in Europe ended on May 8th, the Red Army attacked in the Far East, on Korea and in Manchuria. The Red Army attacked August 8th, 1945. A week later, the war was over. So in other words, the Russian intervention came, but it proved to be unnecessary, because meanwhile, the United States had developed the A-bomb. Now, that of course were not the only decisions. The other decisions pertain to Germany. Germany would be divided up in occupation zones. Now, France, and that is an issue which I should explain now, France was not invited to Yalta. There were only Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. And de Gaulle was not invited, and de Gaulle would never forget nor forgive. Particularly, he did not forget nor forgive Roosevelt, that is the United States, that they did not invite him. But a trick was found, that only those who had under arms more than 500,000 soldiers fighting in Europe would be allowed to participate, and the French, of course, did not. Nonetheless, despite of this, Churchill insisted that France should have its own occupation zone in Germany and in Austria, and also its own occupation sector in Berlin and in Vienna, because it was decided, first of all, that the two countries would be separated, that Austria would be taken away from Germany, would be treated as a separate country, and that the two of them, nonetheless, as being at the origin of the war, that they would be occupied in the first 3 zones. But then Churchill insisted, because Churchill was afraid that the United States would ultimately withdraw, one could never know, at the end of the war, and that the British would find themselves alone facing the Russians. And so he insisted that the French should be given an occupation zone in Germany as well as in Austria, and the same in the 2 capitals sectors, in Berlin as well as in Vienna. But Stalin insisted then that the French share in terms of occupation zone should go at the expense of the United States and of England, and not on his. In other words, he was not willing to give up one part of his own occupation zone. So that is why the French zone was cut off from the American and from the British zone in the west, close to the French border. And the same was true for the French sector, and the same will be done in Austria, and the same will be done in Vienna. What is important, nonetheless, is that the Russian zone included the capital city of Berlin. In other words, Berlin was totally located in the Russian zone. And the same was true for Vienna. Vienna was totally located in the Russian occupation zone. So in other words, the British, the United States and the French, in order to join their sector in Berlin or in Vienna, had to cross through the Russian zone. The western sectors of the capitals were enclaves inside the Russian zone. Germany would be placed under Allied military administration. That is, a military council what would be established of the commanding generals of the occupying forces, and they would run Germany for the time being. In other words, there would be no German government. And the situation will be different for Austria. The Austrians, because to some degree they were still one way or the other halfway considered as victims of what happened to them in 1938, the Austrians were allowed to set up a government for the 4 occupation zones. The same was not granted to the Germans. So far for that. Then comes the issue of Eastern Europe, that is particularly of the German eastern borders, of the borders of Poland and of the Baltic countries. So first of all, Stalin admitted to let Finland in a situation of independence. In other words, not to invade Finland and settleize it or annex it, as he will do for the Baltic countries. In other words, Finland, even though the Finnish had fought on the German side, because the Germans had attacked the Soviet Union and the Finns wanted to get the territories back which Stalin had snatched away from them in 1940. But the Finns, under American pressure, were allowed to stay independent. But they had to give up territories to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union occupied the Finnish territories which had linked northern Finland to the Arctic Sea. And the Finns also had to give up territories in the neighborhood of Leningrad, so that 500,000 Finnish population quit their native territories to move into Finland, and these territories were given to the Soviet Union, so that the border between Finland and the Soviet Union was moved northwards of about 50 kilometers. So Finland lost territories. The Soviet Union, without other, let's say, special stipulations, occupied the 3 Baltic countries. The Western Allies let the Soviet Union keep those territories without major discussions, even though it was said that the final borders of Eastern Europe would be discussed in peace treaties later on. Most important were the borders, the eastern borders of Germany and the borders of Poland. Now, in regards to that, let's take Poland first. There was a Polish government in exile in London. Stalin did not recognize this Polish government he rejected this. He had, on the contrary, set up a so-called provisional Polish government, which was called originally the Lublin Committee. Lublin is a city in eastern Poland, Lublin, where a committee was set up of communist and communist fellow travelers. In other words, people which were Stalin's puppets. He presented this as the provisional Polish government. He would only tolerate that 2 ministers from the exile government in London could join this Lublin Committee, which of course these 2 members of the exile government of London were like the prisoners of this Lublin Committee of Stalin's and had no say. So in other words, as far as the future Polish government was concerned, Stalin had the ultimate say. More important was even Stalin's influence as the borders of Poland were concerned. Stalin claimed that those borders, those territories which Hitler had abandoned to him in the famous non-aggression pact, which at that time was now slowly getting known, as the German archives were, no, they were not even known. The Allies had not even captured the German archives yet. So Stalin claimed that these territories would remain under Soviet control, and that the Polish populations who were living there, there were about 2 million Poles, had to move out. As a compensation for these territories lost in eastern Poland, Stalin claimed that Poland should be given the German territories located west of the Oder-Neisse River. That is, most of Eastern Prussia and of Eastern Germany would be given to Poland. So in other words, there would be a move of the frontiers of Poland of 150 kilometers east to west. The Poles were given those German territories, and the Russians, the Red Army preparing to move in, they terrorized to such a degree the German population that they left in terror before the advancing Russians. And those who did not spontaneously leave were forced out. So in other words, there will be a migration, or I should say, a forced evacuation of German populations from these areas of Eastern Germany, and also from the areas of the Sudeten mountains, of these areas of Czechoslovakia, of altogether between 12 and 13 million people had to move. And you must imagine they moved, and that this is now February, March, April, in the worst climatic circumstances, in the worst conditions, under pressure and under, I would say, under violence on the part of the Polish population, on the part of the Czech population, on the part of the Red Army. It is estimated that 500,000 of those forced resettled people died in this operation. Now, of course, the civilians who were for nothing in what their own army and their own SS had done in Eastern Europe paid now with their lives and their suffering for the crimes committed in the name of Germany in Eastern Europe. But coming back to Poland, so in other words, the Polish territories were moved provisionally, they said. It was not said that this was a final decision, but provisionally Poland was given authority over those territories, and the Germans had to move out.
Wouldn't moving the border into East Germany cut down on Stalin's sphere of influence in East Germany?
Not at all, because you see, on the contrary, you raise a good question. What did this mean in practical terms as far as Poland was concerned? This meant, because Stalin was aware of it, Stalin was aware that the Germans in the future would balk against this decision, that the Germans might claim those territories back, and that they would be furious that they lost those territories again, and that Poland would be in a weak position if it were alone towards a future Germany, if this future Germany re-emerged. So in other words, this meant, in practical terms, that the Poles, in order to keep this decision, to hold on to those territories, had to be backed by Stalin. In other words, this way the Polish dependency on Stalin was ensured for the future. Whereas, you're right, Stalin had a difficult position in the Soviet-occupied areas of Germany, but not only because he cut those territories away from Germany, but because also of the behavior of the Red Army. The Red Army behaved in these territories. Remember, women were raped for weeks and months until ultimately order was restored. And so in other words, all kinds of cruelties and murders and violence prevailed during the transition period of the first weeks and months of Russian occupation of Germany, as well as in Austria, and even to some degree in Hungary. Now, altogether, this was something which Stalin had every reason to be happy with, because he had his way as far as the Polish government was concerned, as far as the Polish borders were concerned, and as far as a de facto situation in terms of Red Army occupation of the Baltic countries and of German and Polish territories were concerned. It was also at that time that the Soviet Union, who had, remember, if you look on the map, when you look on the Baltic countries, there is a a territorial cohesion between Lithuania and the present-day Russian territory, which was Eastern Prussia, Königsberg, Kaliningrad. So the Russians claimed for themselves not only the Baltic countries, but even this area of the Prussian territories, that is, of what is today a Russian enclave on the Baltic Sea, because Lithuania, meanwhile, has become independent. And the mainland Russia is separated now from this advanced territory on the Baltic Sea. So, in other words, Stalin had every reason to be happy, to be satisfied. And in addition, even, in principle, the Western, the British and the Americans and the British agreed to let the Russians have war reparations, because Stalin claimed that the Germans had, when they withdrew from Russia, that they had blown up the factories, the industrial plants, and that he requested that he should be allowed to dismantle a number of German factories and to get money from the Germans in order to rebuild his own industrial potential in Russia. So in other words, the Yalta conference ended on February 11th with these Yalta agreements, which are the ones I just explained to you. The foundation of the UN, the entry of Russia into the war in the Far East, the occupation of Germany into occupation zones and the capitals in occupation sectors, then ultimately the borders of Poland, the borders of Germany, provisional ones, but you know the French have a saying, there's nothing like the provisional which lasts. And that is exactly what the borders today are. So, in other words, Yalta was without any doubt a great victory, a great achievement for Stalin. And it was for that reason, when the Cold War was on, that the French blamed the United States for having abandoned Eastern Europe to the Soviets, and that the Republican administration accused the Democrats, Roosevelt and in particular, for having abandoned Eastern Europe to communism. But of course, particularly the last critic is not justified. Inasmuch that, yes, Stalin was allowed to occupy the areas in Eastern Europe, in Southeastern Europe, and in Central Europe. But the decision to let the Red Army in was taken when in Tehran, in December 1943, it was decided to open up the Second Front in France and not in the Balkan area. So that in that regard, Churchill had been right when he saw what was going to happen. And when he tried then at the Moscow conference to save from the Russian grip at least Greece. And he managed to save that. So once the Yalta conference was over, soon afterwards, Yalta, that was February 11th. By that time, the Battle of the Bulge was also over and the American troops were advancing on the Rhine. But 2 days later, February 13th to the 14th, the US Air Force and the British Air Force did bomb in a senseless way the city of Dresden. That is the city in Saxony where the Russians were not yet that far away, totally destroying the center of the city and causing the deaths, we do not even know how many, but at least of 30,000 or 40,000. At a given moment after the war, the casualty level was even estimated higher. Now, I already mentioned that to you, because the Dresden bombing was to some degree an implementation of the Casablanca Conference decision to break the resistance of the German civilian people, to make them rebel against the Nazis and hasten the end of the war. But of course it hastened nothing. It just caused the death of so many million. Historians tried to find an explanation. for this. The only explanation which could be found, and that of course is a cynical one, is that because the British, French and particularly American move into Germany was stuck at the time, that this should be a demonstration of true air power of the US and of the British, so that the Russians would not sub-evaluate American strength. In other words, it was considered as a proof of strength on the part of the US about their air power. The lives of so many millions were sacrificed. We do not know, because Dresden was not an object of military or strategic importance. There were no factories, important factories there, and there were no military bases or other interesting connections there. Now, but Dresden is only the best known example of this senseless bombing. A month later, on March 16th, can you imagine? The war will be over 6 weeks later. On March 16th, the same senseless bombing did take place against another German city, not as big as Dresden, but culturally and historically and religiously as interesting and as important, the city of Würzburg. Würzburg is a place located in western Bavaria. Würzburg was also bombed and practically destroyed. More than 100,000 people had to move out because the city was in rebel. The argument was again to break the resistance of the civilian population, but it didn't bring anything. Meanwhile, in order to reassure you nonetheless, meanwhile the two cities, Dresden and Würzburg, have been totally rebuilt and look as culturally, I would say, interesting as in the past. And I should also add, as a kind of, I would say, completing your information and so that you understand it. The Germans were the ones who started practicing first this method of bombing civilian targets. Remember Guernica, 1937. Remember Rotterdam. Remember London, 1940. And remember the senseless blowing up of Russian cultural cities like, or cultural monuments, like the summer residences of the Tsars in the neighborhood of Leningrad, which was at that time, Leningrad. And also the destruction of Warsaw, which was also a wanton war crime on the part of the German occupant. But being as it is, this is what happened after Yalta. Now, after Yalta, the relationship, even in the last days and weeks of Roosevelt's life, the relations between the United States and the Soviet Union started deteriorating. Because news came to the US about how the Russians behaved in Romania, in Bulgaria, and in the other occupied territories. How they rounded up, I leave even aside the violences against the civilian population and against women, but how they rounded up political opponents on alleged grounds that they were fascist and that they were Nazis, which was untrue. So in other words, Roosevelt was getting second thoughts about the concessions he had made to Stalin. Then, unexpectedly, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong, he died on April 12. I think it was April 12, 1940. Would you please check that? It's either 12 or 14. I think it was 12. 1945. And Harry Truman stepped into the White House. Truman changed immediately his attitude, not in terms of wrongdoings, but the atmosphere changed. Whereas under Roosevelt, the atmosphere had been, with a little restrictions, relatively friendly. It ceased to be that friendly and that open-minded. It became rather, I would say, formally correct, But to the matter of fact, and the change of atmosphere became evident when Stalin sent his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Molotov, to pay a first visit to the new president, to Truman. Molotov arrived in Washington, and when he got into the White House, where he was received by Truman, when he left the White House, he looked white. This is not now a bad joke with White House, but Truman had spoken in such a stern way to Molotov that Molotov changed his color. Those present during this meeting said that Harry Truman spoke to Molotov in the language of a Missouri mule driver. That is, asking him what they were doing in Romania, Bulgaria, what this and what that was. In other words, from the beginning on, the atmospheric change was evident. The days of the friendly, good comradely relations, which existed over the last 2 years due to Roosevelt's trust in Stalin, those days were gone. And so when the war now came to an end, on May 8th, when the armistice was signed, the first decision which Harry Truman did take was to stop at once all war material deliveries on the part of the US to the Soviet Union. And even those ships which were on their way to deliver military equipment to the Soviet Union were stopped and were turned back to the United States. So in other words, from the beginning on, it became clear that now a much more businesslike, and I would even say stern relationship would begin between Truman and Stalin. But nonetheless, the war was over now in the West. There was a necessity to organize another summit meeting, because after all, now that the war was over, practical decisions should be taken on how to implement those things which had been decided in Yalta before the war was completely over. And so it was decided to organize the third summit meeting, and this third summit meeting did take place in Potsdam. Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin, in other words, again in a Soviet-controlled sector. That has to be said in the first place. Now, a word about this Potsdam summit. I'll just describe I would say the external specificity of this summit meeting. First, the one who did take place in Potsdam and who had already been present in the other summit meeting, that was Stalin. Truman had no experience in foreign policy. He was accompanied by advisors who had been Roosevelt's advisors, but he had to make decisions. And he had no such experience. That is the first thing. That was not all. Churchill had managed to organize in the middle of the Potsdam summit meeting elections in Great Britain. So the summit meeting started, as far as I recall, July the 17th, and will last until August 2nd or 3rd, something like this. And Churchill had then, 1 week after the summit meeting had started, he organized elections in London. He made a miscalculation. Because why did he do this? Because he thought that this way the British people necessarily would elect him, that he would force the hand to the British people, the same as Lloyd George had done after World War I. Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister after World War I, had organized elections right after the armistice was signed. And he had been given a vast majority. But this time, Churchill's calculations were wrong. The British people did not want to have his hand forced, so they voted for the Labour Party. And so the one who came back after the first weekend was not Churchill to continue to participate, but was Clement Attlee, the Labour leader. So in other words, in Potsdam, there was only one who knew the others, the other meetings, and who had a keen eye on what he wanted, whereas the Western allies were represented by two new men who had no experience in foreign policy, Harry Truman and Clement Attlee. Okay, we will stop here.